Before we wrap things up in this introduction to particles, I wanted to take just a second and walk you through some of the more interesting aspects of the particle systems included with the starter content when you create your own project. So here I have a basic blank project. I checked the include starter content checkbox. So I've got these 6 particle systems that come along with that, and I'm just going to take each one of them and look at them briefly and point out the more interesting aspects of each. But to do that, I'd like to build a quick level to just kind of build myself an environment to work in. So you can follow along if you want, or just fast forward. I'm going to bring in a piece of geometry. Let's do something like 1600 by 1600 by, say, 30. I will go ahead and bring in a player start for that. So you can just drag that from basic. Let's go back up to geometry. I'll bring in another box, and we'll pull it way up into the air. Let's do 500 by 500 by, say, I don't know, 320. And then we'll pop that down to the ground. I'm hitting the end key to do that, by the way. Now let's see, which way is the light pointing? The light's coming in from here. So actually, let's slide this over, and then I'll duplicate it in X positive, and we'll make the duplicate 480 by 480 by 310, I suppose. And then we'll hit N to pop that down to the floor. We'll make it subtractive and just sink that right into the box. So now I've got a little alcove that we can kind of work in here. Let's put some materials on here. I'll select both of the pieces of the ground. Let's go ahead and align those. We'll do planar surface. Under materials, I'll scroll way down to the bottom, and there's the little walnut worn texture that I like so much. Let's go ahead and rotate that 45 degrees because I think it looks good. And then, let's see, we'll grab all the adjacent walls. So I'll select one wall, select adjacent surfaces. Well, that's fine, really, except for the floor, so I'll deselect the floor. Actually, let's do adjacent walls instead. I think that'll be better overall. So adjacent wall surfaces, that's great. And we'll do the old clay bricks, which are, there we go. Drag and drop that. We'll take the ceiling and we'll put the basic wall on top so we have a white ceiling. And that should be pretty much good to go. So now I just want to take a moment and build lighting. And with that, I should have a nice little test environment with some indoor and outdoor elements to it. So that's looking pretty good. A little dark, but that's okay for what we're going to be doing. I'll pull my player start out and rotate it back towards my little alcove. Now, let's take a look specifically at these particle systems. I'm going to start with P sparks, which I can just bring in here. We can kind of put it near the entry there. So there's some that's kind of in the dark, kind of in the room itself, and some that isn't. We'll hit G so we can see that. And it looks like I managed to kill my lighting. So let me go ahead and take a moment and rebuild that. Now, this particle system is interesting because it has GPU sprites. Those are colliding, so we've got the little sparks themselves. So those are going to collide with the floor and kind of scatter across. So it's nice to see how that works. Also, we've got a smoke system, which is using particle sub-UVs. Now, if your sub-UVs are something that we didn't cover, but it's easy enough to go over in this aspect just to kind of show it already in motion. So what sub-UVs are is a way to take a flip book of particles and use them kind of like a frame stack. So you'll cycle frame by frame through each one of the particles. And actually, there's a better example coming up here in just a moment. So I'll mention that we've got a setup here in the little smoke emitter. So there's a sub-image index here. But I'm actually going to talk a little more about it when we get to the lit steam example. So the big takeaway here is that you got a couple of things. You've got the GPU sprites, which are creating these sparks here that you can see falling. We can solo that, and you can see the result. And also, we've got, if we solo out the spark burst, we have just a little tiny puff that also has a light module in it. So if we kind of make use of our screen space here, so you can see there's a light module which is lighting up the inside of my room. So it's a nice thing to kind of break apart if you want to see how particles can really start to interact with your environment. So let's go ahead and put that one away. We'll close this out. Now the next one I want to show is the ambient dust. So let's bring this in, and if you deselect it, the trick here is that this is one of those effects that outside you're barely going to see it at all. So here in the outdoors it's kind of felt. If you're moving through you can maybe just barely pick it out. But indoors it becomes a lot more apparent what's going on. You can see these little tiny motes of dust sort of floating around. And it's nice to be able to open this up and kind of see how this was achieved. So really there are several different emitters here, and the reason we have so many is just so that we can assign different types of motion to each one, but you'll notice they're sharing a few things for overall simplicity. So we have one initial size, so all the motes come in at the same size, and then we can change each thing individually. And the trick here is just keeping in mind that we've got a pretty high rate for emission, but also if we take a look at the properties for each emitter, you'll notice that we are emitting from a pretty big initial location. So you see we're going 500 by 500 by 250, negative 500, negative 500 by 250. So a pretty large area within which we're going to be emitting these dust particles. They have a really slow motion to them and then they just fade out. So if you're looking for kind of that ambient sort of effect, this is a really great place to start. All right, so let's put that one away. Now, the next one I want to talk about is the fire. So obviously there's a lot going on here. You can see it's lighting up our scene, which is super cool and awesome. There's smoke, there's sparks, there's embers. Let's go ahead and open it up in Cascade. Lots of different emitters here. So we have the flames. We actually have two sets of flames here. So we have a couple of different behaviors, both of which have their own light components, so they both light up the scene in some way. We have smoke, which is going to be a little easier to see if I take the background color and increase it, like so. Now that smoke is using a subimage index, which again, I'll talk about a little bit more when we get to the steam, just because it's a little easier to visualize at that point. The embers are an interesting thing to look at because they're using the orbit module to control their motion, which is pretty awesome. Let me take that background color and pull it back down to black. So if I turn off the orbit, you can see that these embers are just kind of moving outward and primarily upward, but that orbit module is just causing them to kind of move around a little bit in screen space. So it's just getting a little bit of random motion to them, which is super important and very easy to add by way of an orbit, which is compatible with GPU particles. Then of course we got some sparks. There's also a distortion effect, which is a little easier to see in your level than it will be in Cascade. There's a really subtle ripple taking place, kind of like a heat shimmer effect. So if you wanted to see how to do that, you could just open up the required module for that distortion and then take a look at its material. And you can see how it's using a dynamic parameter to drive refraction. So that's another interesting area where we're using a dynamic parameter, which if I jump back over to Cascade, here's kind of how that works. On a CPU particle system, you can right-click and you'll see parameter, and there is a dynamic module you can add. Now, it's going to tell me I already have one and that I have to remove it, so we'll just pretend like I added this one. And what this gives you is 4 individual parameters that you can really use to do whatever you like. So we can supply it a name, which is going to actually be pulled from the material in this case. So if we right-click on the material, we can say refresh module, and that's called param1. So we can't set that here. That comes in from the material. So over here we have our dynamic parameter. We have our parameter names. It's currently set to param1, but we could set this to something like refraction index, or I think it's actually refractive index, but who's counting really? So we'll set that, we'll apply and save. And so now, over in Cascade, if I right-click and refresh this module, you'll see it's now called refraction index. And we can drive that parameter in any way we like. So let me go ahead and clear out all of my curves here in the curve editor. And we can just graph that out, and let's only look at refraction index. And there you go. You see how it increases and then decreases. So we could take that and we could tweak it And that value then gets sent back and is used to drive the material. So that's also a very interesting technique to check out. Another super useful technique to be aware of with this particle system is the use of depth fading, which is super awesome and a little confusing if you don't know how it works. So I do want to make a point to mention it. If we take this particle system and pull it really close down into the ground, notice something. The particles do not seem to be clipping harshly against the wall. As a matter of fact, I could take the whole particle system and I could set it against the wall, and you don't see anywhere that those sprite particles are clipping harshly against the wall. They're actually fading out wherever they get close to the wall. And if you don't understand what I mean, I'm going to show you. Let's go grab the material that's driving the flame. So here inside of my emitters, let's grab flames, go to the required module, and I'll open up mfire sub UV. And there's the depth fade node. Notice it's the last node right before we plug into opacity. Now, here's how this works. If I disconnect it, in fact, let's just bypass it altogether. We'll just go right from, so you see it's actually a fairly simple material. We'll go right from our clamp straight to opacity, thereby bypassing depth fade, and I'll apply that. Now it's probably going to take a second to come back through on the flames. It's going to, oh, there we go. So now without depth fade, take a look. We're getting these harsh edges wherever the flame particles are passing through the wall. And you can see those. As a matter of fact, if I get out of real time, there you go. There's one highlighted for your pleasure right there, that early harsh straight line. And that looks terrible. However, the depth fade solves that problem. It's going to give you a fade distance, so it's a distance over which the actual opacity will fade away wherever the particle intersects a wall. So now we'll plug that back in, we'll reapply, and now we've got to play again, so I'll hit Control-R to fire up real time for just a minute, and then we'll hit Control-R again, and now check it out. You don't see any of those harsh edges. So wherever those particles are running into the wall, they're fading away, which is a super useful technique, and you should definitely use that one to your advantage. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the fire. We can go ahead and put that away, and I'll close out Cascade. The next one I want to talk about is the explosion. So this is pretty cool. It only fires off once, and that is it, which makes it a really interesting candidate for research if you want to know about burst particles. And here's how this works. In the spawn module, you'll notice that all of these have a spawn rate of 0. And instead, they're using the particle burst list. Probably the most apparent one would be, say, the fireball. That's just going to have one entry in the burst list. And what this means is it is going to emit 6 particles. And we're not using a count here. So that means we are emitting exactly 6 particles. And we're doing it the moment the emitter is activated. So it has a time currently set to 0. So right at the moment the particle system is activated, this particular emitter is going to emit 6 particles all at once, and then it's done. And that's the idea of a burst list. If we wanted it to emit again at a later time, we could add another entry into the burst list and say, maybe, emit 6 more at about 0.5 seconds. So half a second later, it would fire out 6 more particles. That's how bursts work. The only thing is you'd want to make sure that you then took your rate and set it back down to 0, because you don't want rate to be a factor here. You just want to use the burst list. Also make sure that you are processing the burst list. Okay, so that's the explosion. The explosion one is actually more useful in terms of a blueprint. So if you really wanted to utilize it, you want to be able to time when it happens. There is a blueprint effect explosion. And if we go into the event graph, there's probably nothing for it right now, but you could create some sort of an event which would cause it to happen. So let's say for instance, we could say on begin play, so let's make one up real quick. I don't think there's anything in here for us to really stop it. Let's go over to components. Yeah, so it's just one quick little explosion. Let's say we do a begin play, and on begin play we'll do a delay, and that delay will be for, let's say, 3 seconds. And then we'll take our explosion audio and we'll activate it. And we could also take our particle explosion, and I believe we can just activate that as well. So plug both those in, we can compile, and then we can drag this in, and if we play, then boom, there it is right there. Now, you'll notice it exploded twice, and that's because of the settings of the components. So we'd want to make sure that our explosion particle system, so we got our P explosion here. If we take a look in its settings, it's probably starting active. Yep, there it is. There's auto activate at the bottom. We don't want that to be on. And then for the audio, also turn off auto activate, and then compile and save. And that way, when we play the game, boom, there we go. And if you saw 2, it's because I still have the original particle system there. So I need to basically get rid of that. We can play. So we have nothing, 1, 2, 3, boom. So that is how you would use a particle system by way of a blueprint, which is another way that this particular particle system is kind of specially useful because it gives you a means to examine how to do that sort of thing. Okay, the last two are the P-smoke and the P-steam lit, which in a lot of ways are very much the same thing. So I'm really just going to focus on the P-steam lit. The difference between the two is that steam one is using a lit material, which is super awesome for particles. It just looks so good. So there it is. You also notice it's fading as it rolls across the ground, so it's using that depth fade node we talked about earlier. We can do some fun things with it. If we hold down the L key, I can add a light up here to the corner, so that's holding down L and clicking. Let's pull the attenuation radius of that down just kind of far, and then we'll pull the intensity down as well, and we'll give this some color. Let's say we make this one kind of a really cool light. Actually, I'll kick the attenuation radius back up. And then we'll duplicate this off to the other side. I'm going to make it movable as well. So we'll pull this over to the other side, and we'll make this one sort of a warm light. And if you look, you can actually see the lights affecting those particles. And the reason it's affecting is not really because of the particles themselves, but because of the material, which is one of the ways that this is extremely useful. You can open up the material here, and you can see the translucency settings required to give you a nice volumetrically lit particle. So definitely pick that apart. The key is going to be in these translucency settings. And make sure your blend mode is, of course, set to translucent, because you won't get much of a result if you don't do that. Also, if we come over to the emitter itself, we have sub-image indexing going on. And that's why, essentially what that means is each particle is playing a frame-by-frame video of steam. And if we take a look back in the material, we can see the texture sample that's driving that. Here it is. Actually, I believe this is just a single cloud effect. Yeah, that's just being used to kind of help colorize. The particle sub-UV has its own texture here. And this is an 8x8 grid of frames of animation for how this smoke would move around. So that's essentially how sub-UVing works. It's going to take a single texture and break it up into a grid. The way you'd set that up is first you'd have this texture already rendered out, and you can make these in a lot of different ways. For a while, I was creating them inside of Maya by doing like a fluid simulation for a really cool looking thing like an explosion. And then you just render that out to individual frames, and inside of Photoshop in just a couple of minutes, you can break that up into a grid of all the frames, and there you go. Just make sure they're all spaced evenly. Now, once you have that texture, you then put that into your material by way of a particle sub-UV node. It is a special node. So if we type in particle, you'll see it. There's particle sub-UV right there. That requires that you put a texture inside of it. Now, currently, I had a texture selected, so it automatically dropped that one in there. Then in Cascade, there's a couple of different things you got to do. In the required module, you would need to come down to sub-UV, set your interpolation method. This is how you're going to blend from one frame to another. Linear blend is a pretty solid one. Also, you're going to need to set the sub-images horizontal and vertical. We had an 8x8 grid, so you can see the correlation there. There's 8x8. Next, you've got to use the sub-image index module to blend between each one of those frames. By the way, this won't work on a GPU particle system, just thought I'd mention. So the way that works right now, this is being driven by a curve. So let's go ahead and let's Let's just look at that one curve, and we'll frame that up. And you can see, in this case, it's being, there's a smooth curve taking place. And all this is doing is transitioning from frame 0 to frame 63. So there's all 64 frames, but notice there's an offset here, and I want to point that out especially. It's just to give you a little bit of transition room. Point 0, or that first point, actually has an in value, or a point along the timeline, not of 0, which is the birth of the particle, but of 0.125, so just a tiny little fraction of a second after the particle is born. And then its out value, the last point, the point number 1, has an in value of 0.8, so that doesn't run all the way to 1. So you keep your keyframes inset a little bit from your 0 and 1 extents. That way you've got plenty of room for the interpolation to run, and that way you end up seeing all of your frames. So definitely important and worth keeping in mind. So really with that, that's a quick overview of why a lot of these different starter particle systems are important to use. I highly recommend you take a look at them and try to recreate them or edit them and kind of change them around in your own image. That is going to wrap things up for this video. Thanks for watching.